This is Land of Havilah, Mark 13b. When a certain generation sees the following, that same generation will see the coming of Christ in great power and glory. Verse 14. But when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let him who's on the housetop not go down, nor enter in to take anything out of his house. Let him who's in the field not return back to take his cloak. But woe to those who are with child and to those who nurse babies in those days. Pray that your flight won't be in the winter, for in those days there will be oppression such as there has not been the like from the beginning of the creation which God created until now, and never will be. Unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would have been saved, but for the sake of the chosen ones whom he picked out, he shortened the days. Then if anyone tells you, look, here's the Christ, or look there, don't believe it, for there will arise false Christs and false prophets, and will show signs and wonders that they may lead astray, if possible, even the chosen ones. But you watch. Behold, I've told you all things beforehand. Comment. To start, let's define abomination. It's something that's highly insulting to God, a sin of extreme disrespect toward God, something abominable to him. The other tion word here is desolation. Abomination results in desolation. If a man commits an abomination, God will withdraw and leave the man in a state of desolation, or the land in a state of desolation, or the temple in desolation. In verse 14, Jesus gave the key to getting our bearings by saying that the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel would be the sign that there will be more events coming. Man will commit an abomination which will result in a desolation. When the abomination takes place, those who are in Judea should flee, because immediately there'll arise oppression in the land such as never before or after. The abomination will be the sign that someone's out to defy God and destroy his people, so the people should run. This will be a time when false Christs and prophets will arise and lead many astray. Therefore, when we turn to Daniel, which is where Jesus directed us in verse 14, what is the abomination of desolation? It's two places in Daniel. The first one's in chapter 11, verse 31, which was about a despicable king who would arise and set up an abomination in the temple. That turned out to be Antiochus Epiphanes. He lived about 400 years after Daniel, but 200 years before Jesus. So that couldn't be the abomination of the future that Jesus was referring to. But then in chapter 12, verse 1, Daniel transitions to, quote, a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time, end quote. So we know Daniel's transition now to the time Jesus referenced in verse 19 that we just read, quote, in those days there will be oppression such as there has not been the like from the beginning of the creation which God created until now and never will be, end quote. This is the great tribulation of the end times. Daniel confirms he's speaking of those times in verses 2 and 4 of chapter 12. So, what will that abomination be, standing where it ought not, as Jesus put it? In the great tribulation, there'll be a, quote, man of sin, end quote, who, quote, sits as God in the temple of God, setting himself up as God, 2 Thessalonians 2:4. This is probably the same event described in Revelation 13, that an image of the beast will be constructed. The image will be given breath so that it can speak and cause as many as won't worship it to be killed. There's been no temple of the Jews since 70 A.D. The Romans destroyed it that year. They tore it down stone by stone, as Jesus predicted. So for the beast, or man of sin, or Antichrist, as he's variously known, to set himself up in the temple to be worshipped as God, the temple will have to be rebuilt. The tearing down of the temple in 70 A.D. wasn't an abomination to God. It was the will of God. It wasn't God's original will that the temple be torn down, but when Israel kept sinning and kept using the temple to worship him falsely, after having killed his son, then it was God's will to tear it down. God caused it to happen because of Israel's disobedience, Luke 13:34 and 35, and Luke 19:42 to 44. So we shouldn't confuse the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D., which God performed intentionally through the Romans, with the abomination that the Antichrist will set up in the rebuilt temple during the Great Tribulation. The land was left desolate in 70 A.D., just like there will be another desolation of it in the time of the Great Tribulation. But the first desolation was Israel reaping what they sowed, and the second desolation will be the persecution of Israel by the coming Antichrist. Back to the passage at hand, starting with the remark about the abomination of desolation, Jesus was speaking of the Great Tribulation. He said, when you see that, then some other things will happen. His statement in verse 19 about unprecedented oppression is confirmation he was speaking of the Great Tribulation, which is the name he gave it himself in Matthew 24:21, and also the name Revelation 7:14 gives it, the Great Tribulation. In verse 20, no flesh could survive unless those days were shortened. This is another confirmation that Jesus is speaking of the Great Tribulation. No flesh means no man or animal. Conditions of nature will be so severe that no man or animal could survive unless those days were brought to an end. Conditions will be so difficult in the Great Tribulation, with famines, pestilence, economic collapse, political oppression, religious persecution, and disturbances of nature, the people of the world will be desperately looking for answers. That'll give an opening in verses 21 to 23 for false Christs and false prophets to arise. People of the earth will be so desperate they'll gladly listen to anyone offering solutions. The false Christs and prophets will have the power to show signs and wonders so impressive that even God's chosen would be led astray if possible. The first and second beasts of Revelation 13 will be prime examples of those false Christs and prophets. In verse 23, Jesus said, "Behold, I've told you all things beforehand." Therefore, instead of listening to those false Christs and prophets during that time, everyone in that hour should pay attention to what Jesus already said about it, because he nailed it in the Bible. Before we go on, we should revisit the flight from Judea in terms of Matthew's and Luke's versions. Matthew's version is the same as Mark's, that when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, those who are in Judea should flee. It's a prophecy of the Great Tribulation, that the Antichrist will set himself up in the temple, or set his image up in the temple, which is an abomination. The persecution of all Israel will be imminent, so those in Judea should flee. But in Luke, Jesus gave the same advice to flee Judea in connection with the coming destruction of 70 A.D. Quote, "When you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the middle of her depart. Let those who are in the country not enter therein. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled." Luke 21:20-22. It will be the days of the vengeance of the Lord on Israel. So, on the one hand, in Luke, the sign to flee Judea would be when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, which has already been fulfilled in 70 A.D., and on the other hand, in Matthew and Mark, the sign to flee Judea would be when you see an abomination in the temple, which will occur in the Great Tribulation. The advice on earth was the same in both cases, but heaven's viewpoint of the two events would be starkly different. It'll be God's vengeance on one hand and an abomination to God on the other. Your narrator reserves the right to change his opinion as time goes on, because we see in a mirror dimly, 1 Corinthians 13:12. God keeps secrets, Psalm 25:2, and prophecies are riddles, Numbers 12:8. But this is the way I see it at this time. At the close of the Great Tribulation, verse 24, "But in those days after that oppression, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from the sky, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Then they'll see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he'll send out his angels and will gather together his chosen ones from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the sky." Comment: for the inhabitants of the earth in the Great Tribulation, even to people who pay no attention to the Scripture, The approaching end will be evident when they see the sun and moon darkened and stars falling from the sky. But just when conditions look unsurvivable, that no flesh could be saved, in verses 26 and 27, the Son of Man will come with great power and glory and gather his chosen ones. Regarding the functioning of the sun, God told Noah, quote, "While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night will not cease." Genesis 8:22. Since all these natural cyclic events are directly related to normal functioning of the sun, when you see the sun ceasing to function at the end of the Great Tribulation, it'll be an obvious sign of the end. Verse 28. "Now from the fig tree learn this parable. When the branch has now become tender and produces its leaves, you know that summer is near. Even so you also, when you see these things coming to pass, know that it is near at the doors. Most certainly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things happen." Comment: the generation that sees the abomination of desolation won't pass away until everything Jesus just mentioned comes to pass. They'll see oppression like never since creation in verse 19, worldwide unsurvivable conditions in verse 20, false Christs and prophets working signs and wonders in verse 22, disturbances in the heavenly bodies in verses 24 and 25, the coming of the Son of Man in great power and glory in verse 26, and the angels gathering the chosen ones in verse 27, all in one generation. Was he serious? Verse 31. "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day or that hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father." Comment: in verse 31, Jesus said heaven and earth will pass away. Peter expounded on that, quote, "But the heavens that now exist and the earth have been stored up for fire. The heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will be dissolved with fervent heat, and the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. But we look for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells." 2 Peter 3:7, 10, and 13. In verse 32, "No one knows the day or hour but the Father. The Father has the final day marked on his private calendar. No one will pinpoint the day or hour, but men filled with the Holy Spirit will recognize the approximate time when they witness the series of events from verses 14 to 25. It'll be like a fig leaf putting forth its leaves. You'll know what's next. Verse 33, "Watch, keep alert, and pray, for you don't know when the time is. It's like a man traveling to another country, having left his house, and given authority to his servants, and to each one his work, and also commanded the doorkeeper to keep watch. Watch therefore, for you don't know when the Lord of the house is coming, whether at evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he might find you sleeping. What I tell you, I tell all. Watch." Comment: in the parable, a man departed to another country and left his servants in charge of his affairs. Christ is the man who departed, and we're the servants he left in charge. We should tend his business until he comes back. In verse 37, Jesus' one-word conclusion to all this was watch, meaning watch these things unfold and watch that you don't fall asleep. Mark 14's next at landofhavilah.net, Mark 14.